Good evening. My name is John Richardson. This is March 10th, 2014, and we continue with our bi-weekly show, Independent Nation, along with my colleague, Bahman Yazdanfar. And we continue our general discussion about democracy in Canada. I think tonight we're going to talk specifically about elections, perhaps the role of the electoral officer, and as always, to encourage and get the perspective of once and future candidates. Bahman, your thoughts, and perhaps you'd like to introduce our guest for this evening.
Good evening. My name is Bahman. I'm the co-host of the Independent Nation. First of all, I'm glad you're here this week. Last time we missed you, John. And tonight we have a very distinguished man who has been in this process, the electoral process, for a number of years. And not only as a candidate, but also as an investigator and as a voice for the democracy, federally, of course. And I asked him, Will Arlo, to introduce himself and tell us about his background and why people should listen to you, Will.
Thanks, Bahman. I don't know about distinguished, but certainly I've been in the trenches a while. I've started into the electoral process in 1997, and there was a general election, if you remember that year, in which I did not participate as a candidate. I supported the candidacy of another member of the party, and my first election I ran in was a by-election in 1998, and I've run 6 more times since then, so that means 7 federal elections.
Which party was that?
That's with the Canadian Action Party. So, you know, I'm a tradesman, a steel fabricator, very much, I think, an ordinary guy who had been enormously discouraged with what I saw on the political landscape. In other words, I just didn't see much in the way of choice, real choice. There were different party offerings, but really when you got down to sort of analyzing the policy agenda, you couldn't really tell the difference. So and I had been sort of enormously discouraged with being hoodwinked by Brian Mulroney, because I believed, you know, when the free trade negotiations were going on and there was a lot of talk about it, I believed what my government told me. I believed it was a trade deal.
Wasn't it?
Wasn't a trade deal.
In what respect was it not a trade deal?
Well,
and that would be the first question I would ask, and the second question would be, what was it then, if not a trade deal?
It was an investment deal. And it wasn't a trade deal because there was nothing new in it in terms of trade. The agreement by which Canada conducted its trade relationship with the United States was the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, and that was a Truman initiative. It was an initiative of the Harry Truman administration, and so we had already a situation where we had basically free trade already. In terms of trade, we already had that. There were only a few items, a very small percentage of the trade relationship that had any tariffs on it. Those tariffs were already on a scale of being ratcheted down. That was going on incrementally. That was part of the GATT. And it only represented a small percentage of Canada's total trade. So in terms of what was new with the FTA about trade, there was nothing. It was just a reiteration of the GATT. What was new was investment provisions. Basically, Canada gave up the right to say who was welcome in Canada as an investor and under what terms.
Well, you know, I'd love to have you elaborate on that in a minute. I'm thinking back now. That would have been 87, 88. Those were the days when the free trade agreement was in the news.
Yeah.
And you know, it's funny. I haven't thought about Brian Mulroney for some years, so you just mentioned him. But I remember there was an election fought over that. The Liberals at the time were led by John Turner. And I remember actually Brian Mulroney selling the free trade agreement partly on the basis that he was using the phrase secured access to the richest market in the world, the richest consumer market in the world, or something like that, and that somehow the free trade agreement was different from the GATT because this particular agreement was a treaty and therefore had a higher status somehow. Is that your recollection of it?
Well, I remember very much the hook being secured access. Secured access to the market to the south was because I was a tradesperson and manufacturing and all that sort of stuff, and I knew what Canadians can do when they're at work. I had no fear of competing with U.S. or any country on trade.
Particularly with a very low Canadian dollar at the time.
It wasn't that low at the time. It fell. The dollar drop happened really under Chrétien's regime. But, trade, fair competition in trade with the prospect of an open market to the U.S. was really appealing to me. I never sort of got down to thinking about how the free trade agreement would do that, would guarantee access any more than proximity already does. Because, of course, proximity, of course, is the best guarantee. They're our neighbors.
Yeah, lower cost of delivery.
There you go. But I remember that was the hook, secured access. It turned out to be false. The Americans just cut off access whenever they choose, right?
But interestingly enough, this free trade negotiation between U.S. and Canada has been around since late 1800s. And originally liberals are very in favor of that, and conservatives always were against that. And all of a sudden in 1984, 85, something happened that immediately conservatives said, hey, listen, we are on the boat for this matter. Because it was sitting in a kind of the hibernation for about 40, 50 years.
It's neat that you brought it back around that way, because it really points at what I talked about when we first started about it. When you get down to the policy agenda, there's no difference. Because, of course, in opposition, Chrétien's liberals swore that they would never ratify NAFTA, right? Didn't
they also make some noise about, we hate the GST, we'll get rid of it?
Well, yes, the same thing, the same principle. They are just...
So that winds back to what we're here to talk about, which is electoral process. And why it is these guys get away with making promises the moon and the stars. And then once they're elected, guess what?
Before we get to that, I have one more question on this. I mean, I think this is very interesting, because about a year ago, I actually saw Brian Mulroney speak at the Rotman School of Business. And, this is years after he was, Prime Minister. And regardless of what you think about Brian Mulroney, I mean, it was a fascinating couple of hours, to see him there. But he made a very, very interesting point or statement that I guess I hadn't consciously realized at the time. But he said that as a result of the free trade agreement, Canada actually was forced to change its tax system. In the sense that they got rid of the, I guess it was the manufacturer's excise tax or something like that, to reduce the cost of Canadian goods. And, I think it's interesting how these types of international agreements can really put pressure on internal domestic laws. Particularly in the area of taxation, and we see this today. The government of Canada has just signed a FATCA, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act agreement with the United States, where they're promising to change all kinds of laws along with that too.
Well, and it really, I mean, there's no structural necessity for that to happen. It really just happens because of the relationships and the influence that is brought to bear within those relationships, right? So you have, I remember being at a trade show in Toronto one time and talking with somebody who had approached my booth about Canadian competitiveness and all that sort of stuff. And he was one of our American friends, and he was hostile to the idea that Canada had a public health care system. He regarded that as an unfair subsidy for Canadian labor. And well, I said, because the Canadian healthcare system costs 1/3 of what the American system costs, and because it delivers better outcomes, that's an unfair subsidy. I think that's just smart policy. He walked away in a huff.
That's an incredibly interesting example, because that whole issue, it's like the same issues keep reoccurring, and it's coming up in conjunction with the whole Obamacare discussion. Yeah, but what I used to hear stats at the time that the absence of a public health care system in the United States increased the manufacturing costs of GM, Ford, and Chrysler by roughly $1,000 a car, because they had to actually provide this on their own dime.
Because it's so expensive, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, I think that one can logically, whether at the end of the day it's right or wrong, but logically make the argument that, in fact, the lack of a public health care system in the United States has for years put U.S. manufacturers at an extreme competitive disadvantage.
Yeah, it's whether an extreme or not, I don't know.
$1,000 a car,
it's big.
It's very big.
It's big.
Yeah. Well, how do they get away with this?
I think it's just dogma. They say things often enough that they believe it's true.
Who says that?
Well, all countries do it to a certain extent. There's all in most countries there's this popular sentiment expressed, at least, that this is the greatest country in the world. And certainly you can't find a country in the world that believes that to a greater extent than the U.S.
China.
They certainly believe it's the greatest country in the world, and the empirical evidence is all aside. It doesn't matter what the evidence suggests.
What's that Allen book, that classic "As a Man Thinketh"? I mean, it's interesting you put it that way, because the great strength of America, I think, has been the ability, particularly you can see this in World War II, I suppose, to basically harness, the sort of public sentiment, to believe that they're all engaged in a great cause. So, there are advantages to that, okay, but, there are clear disadvantages as well.
Yeah.
Of course, if you compare, the politics and the electoral systems in Canada and the U.S., I mean, to move us into this, I mean, there are a number of differences, even though they both call themselves democracies. But one of the things that I find fascinating about Canada is that the current government under Stephen Harper is the Reform Party of Preston Manning, really. And, I remember seeing Preston Manning speaking about 1990, when it was just a fledgling party, but yet it took that party 16 years to become the government of Canada. And, that could not happen in the United States. I mean, there's no way that some third party could create itself and in 16 years become the government.
Yeah, the two-party system has really got that country by the throat.
Some people say a two-party system is only one party removed from a one-party system.
Well, of course, that's a factual truth, but the philosophical truth behind that is I think even more kind of powerful and insidious in a way. I had somebody sent me a request to comment. Well, we're going to go all over the place, aren't we?
Probably.
I had somebody sent me a comment about the Star Wars plan, because that's now back on the table, right? Missile defense and all
that's
that.
Back on the table?
Yeah, it is. It is. And,
I did not know that.
Yeah. So I had somebody send me a comment asking me what I thought might be the reasons and what I should comment about that. And my comment was that that the whole Cold War, in my view, happened because Truman was terrified of mishandling the inertial forces of the mobilization of the U.S. in World War II. So demobilization was going to be very tricky to handle, and he had no electoral mandate. FDR died in office. So if that got mishandled, USA was going to be a train wreck. And so instead, he decided to launch the Cold War so that he could redeploy millions of troops rather than bring them home to no jobs.
Give the military something to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So now Star Wars is back on the table, and you have to wonder if the sort of the elites, the financial and political elites haven't sort of realized that free market capitalism has kind of run its course. But there isn't even a political space to discuss demobilization of free market capitalism, because it really was a weapon of war. That was really the mechanism that brought the Soviet Union to its knees. They just spent them into submission in an arms race. So now that whole program has kind of run its course, and free market capitalism is kind of a rogue force now in the world, just wrecking stuff everywhere. But there's no political space to talk about demobilizing, just like Truman was terrified of talking about demobilization after World War II, everyone's terrified to talk about demobilizing free market capitalism. In Canada, there might, that space, you might open that space to actually talk about that, but you certainly couldn't talk about that in the U.S. And that is blasphemy. You don't talk about ideas like demobilizing free market capitalism. You just, no one will look at you. I mean, that is tantamount to blasphemy. Because, if you, whatever people say about their religious beliefs, what you have to admit is that in North America and lots of Western Europe now, God is really money, and religion is capitalism. That's really what it is, right?
But there is democracy that they say.
That's window dressing on top, right?
Yeah.
In Canada, we still have a little space, I think, to talk about some of those ideas that are much farther from the political center. But, in the U.S., that space is very constrained. There's just stuff you just don't talk about. Obama got himself in trouble. Remember, he was touring the Rust Belt, and he said, these jobs have been gone for 20 years, and they're not coming back. Ooh. You don't say stuff like that, right?
Well, I don't know if in... in some of the so-called democracies in existence today, there's much room to talk about anything. Part of the problem with the U.S., I mean, Bauman and I, of course, have always been strong proponents of independent candidates. At the same time, I think very, at least in my case, I don't mind admitting it, very hostile, to party politics. But you look at at what's going on in the United States, and there's no discussion of anything that really matters, because everything is seen as part of the endless war, one party versus another party. I mean, there are some areas where perhaps the Democrats make sense. There are some areas where perhaps the Republicans make sense.
Yeah, but I mean, the guy in the last several electoral cycles, the guy that's been making sense, Ralph Nader, gets no traction at all, right? I mean,
he doesn't even mention.
So, but again, that actually, having that discussion there brings us back around, I think, and it's a good way to do it, to bring us back around to where we're headed in Canada now, which very much, I think, the Harper government is engineering circumstances so we rapidly become a two-party state.
Well, there is the different. One said the difference between two-party tyranny and one-party tyranny is just one.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not far to fetch to see if we have another majority government federally with the Conservatives, then they have a blank check to whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
Is it really in the interest of the Harper Conservatives for Canada to be a two-party state? I mean, it seems to me that the present Conservative government of Canada is very much like the Liberals in the 90s, really just benefiting from, the opposition being split. In fact, the only reason the Conservatives have a majority is because of Jack Layton's popularity.
Well, without dealing with that issue directly, I think, the more important thing about it is that it narrows the discourse. If you don't have broad political participation, if you don't have a big space to talk about ideas that many people will think of as somewhat or very radical, if you don't have the space to talk about those things, then the whole field of maneuver narrows so much that it really doesn't matter much who's in power. You get back to the situation in the U.S. where they're really track set by their ideology, by the things they can't say. They're not governed by the things they do say. They're governed by the things they can't say. So, Harper engineering the federal election system so that it's so difficult for parties to finance themselves. So it's so difficult for people on the margins of society to be able to vote. So that it's impossible for the watchdogs in the system at Elections Canada, the commissioner, to be able to, in a timely way, pursue investigations where electoral fraud has been suggested or is possibly provable, to exempt themselves, the power parties, to exempt themselves from having to declare how much money they spend fundraising. All that stuff, makes it it's lining up to a situation where there's just no practical way for any other parties but the main ones to participate. They're
talking about Bill C-23.
Well, not just
C-30.
Not just 23. There's been half a dozen or more bills since the Conservatives came to power in 2006. I mean, in their first piece of legislation, Bill C-2, it was called at that time, the so-called Accountability Act. That's when they launched the first attack against the electoral system.
Well, I wonder if you could do this, leaving aside the designations of the bills, just in sort of people talk. What do you see the Harper government as having done to exclude people from participation in the political process, whether it's parties or people or whoever? Because, they've got, what, 38% of the vote in the last election?
General?
Yeah.
By general election, we had about close to 59.
No, percent turnout. But what did the Conservatives get?
The Conservatives got about 33% of the people who turn out, and the number of MPs that are sitting right now in the Parliament, the total is about 18% of the eligible voters in Canada.
Absolutely incredible.
That means they claim they are majority, but there's no such a thing as a majority. There's not even 50%.
Well, they have the legal designation of being a majority government.
But 60%, about 60% of eligible Canadian, about 60% of eligible Canadian voters made a different electoral choice.
Right. Well,
that's not democracy.
No, it's not. But why not put it a different way? Because a lot of them are not voting. How about? But
that's an electoral choice.
You would say that since it not votes an electoral choice? Well, I don't know about that, because isn't part of the problem here is that it's so hard for some people to vote that they just give up?
Well, that's the way the Conservatives are running it. I mean, Elections Canada, the arm's length independent agency that runs elections at the federal level, they have a mission statement. And their mission statement is to facilitate the participation of Canadian voters in the electoral system, both as electors and as candidates. That's the job that Elections Canada has been given historically. That's their mission statement. That's what they're to do. Well, you can't do that. You can't do that if the rule book that they use to pursue that mission statement makes it impossible to do it. Right, and so that's what's happening. The new voter identification rules that make it difficult for people to establish their identity to the satisfaction of the legislation, not at all to the satisfaction of what's necessary to establish that they're eligible to vote. That's easy to do. So they create barriers for people to actually show up and vote. And it's interesting because the barriers show up for young people and old people and the poor. Largely that's where the barrier, the poor, Aboriginals, inner city, highly mobile people, and elderly. So if you look at the way the demographics are of who gets pushed off of the electors list by making stringent identification requirements, it's all people, or mostly people, that aren't very likely to vote Conservative.
Well, in last program, John was not here. I had two guests, one young and one my age, older or old. Either way. And I asked both of them, although both of them were very active in their own activities and picking their own fights and trying to advocate and educate their peers and friends and their communities, I asked them why don't they participate in the electoral process. And although both of them are from two different generations, both said to me that they don't see any hope or any light at the end of the tunnel of the electoral process in order to be able to make any changes or any difference in the life of your community. And what you are telling me that since 2006 or 2007 when they started with the C2 and they started gradually to put these barriers, is it just because of that, or it is just completion of something that has been there, and now it become more rigid.
No. Elections Canada's people internally have been very concerned about sliding voter participation, and they've been very actively engaged. I know it's difficult for people to point at specific examples unless it happens to be stuff you pay attention to. But when elections have been on, there's on radio and TV, Elections Canada has sponsored advertisements that invited people to speak up when somebody was listening. All kinds of outreach programs. Elections Canada has PDF files on its website for school administrators to run mock elections in their own schools under the same rule book, basically, so that children have a chance to learn how the electoral process works while they're in school, which is eminently smart thing to do, right? Train people when you have a chance.
To learn the process.
To learn the process so that they're not afraid of it. Lots of studies about, talking to people to find out why they don't vote and what can be done to facilitate. All that stuff has been very much on the mind, and Elections Canada has been very active in looking for the reasons and for the remedies that can be applied within the Act. It's the Conservatives who have constrained and narrowed the scope of action that's available to Elections Canada to actually apply remedies.
So if the ordinary Joe, as John said earlier, let's say a normal ordinary Joe that has half enthusiasm to participate either as a voter, as a volunteer, as a candidate, or as any form and shape to help to the process, what has happened since 2007 till now, in the last 7 years, by present government that affected him or her directly from this process?
Well, for one thing, if that person was interested in a particular political party, if it was other than the Liberals or the Conservatives, and to some extent the NDP, if he had a view to participating with any other political party, he was going to notice that political party was struggling for its very existence, because the legislation has made it tougher for those political parties to simply exist.
And how so?
It made it tough to raise money.
Okay. If you can round this out with examples a bit.
Like, for instance, Action Party that you were involved, you can give.
Having trouble raising money.
Yeah. There was, there's been evolution in the way elections have been financed. Back in the days of John A., he could write letters to his friends and ask for another $10,000 to buy, beef and whiskey, right?
Yeah.
So we got to a place where, when I joined the system in the late 1990s and started looking at that, you could offer people tax receipts as a candidate or an agent, somebody who's raising money for a political party. You could offer people tax receipts for practically unlimited amounts of money, which is why in those times, when the money was coming from mostly two places, it was coming from financial institutions and from unions. Why financial institutions, for instance, got tax receipts for multi-million-dollar donations that they donated to all of our parties. So in 2003, that all changed, where there was a system brought in place by Chrétien, mostly to cut Paul Martin off from big money, but nevertheless it was good for the country. Nevertheless, it was good for the country. The system brought in
personal feud sometimes has some advantages.
Yes, you take your wins when you can get them. But there was a system brought in where political parties were financed by a subsidy on a per vote basis. So then democracy becomes possible, because political parties get financed by the way people vote, not by who's got the biggest wallet.
And we are talking about that $1.95 or $1.75 which was.
Now, just to pause you there for 1 second. My understanding of that is, though, that in order to get that subsidy, you have to get 10% of the vote.
No, you had to have 2% of the vote nationally, or 5% in any constituency.
That means it's very tough for small parties and independent, of course.
Right.
It means essentially that it means that they're almost never going to be able. I mean, you have to reach a certain size to be able to get break that threshold,
that,
they're never going to be able to get there.
You have to have enough money to get to that.
I mean, what I don't understand is why they would be excluded anyway. Why should there be a threshold? If you're going to run a system, where there's a kickback to parties based on percentage of votes, I mean, why would you have a threshold at all?
Because if, for instance, the Canadian Action Party or any of the other, say, 12 or 13 other federal political parties that are out there, because there are that many. There's 18 or 19 federal political
18
parties.
18 or 19, yes.
So if any of those other parties actually got to a place where they were actually financed on the per vote basis, for instance, if the Canadian Action Party had been had received $1.80 per vote for every vote they got in the 2000 or 2004 general election, it would have made a huge difference in the profile of the party. People actually would have become aware that party exists.
No, I understand. That would be why the main parties would not want this.
Would put that threshold in there to make sure the small parties stay small. Because if you give the small parties anything
right,
like
and of course the legislation comes from the main parties. Right. So let me ask you this. It seems to me the problem's the parties to begin with.
It is. It's one of the problems.
I mean, there's nothing in the British North America Act. There's nothing about the origins of Westminster democracies in general that require political parties. I mean, all they are just voting coalitions that grew up over the years.
Conspiracies.
Yeah, they're exactly right. They're conspiracies, some of which perhaps are criminal and some of which are just conspiracies. But that's exactly what they are. They're essentially voting agreements, right? They're agreements to vote as a bloc.
There is my list shows 23 federal registered political parties. Registered. We are not talking about non-registered.
I would be surprised if
it could be 3 or 4 of them is gone. It's about 17, 18.
Dormant parties. Some of them
they're dormant. They're just name and people sitting there with maybe in their apartment.
Well,
that creates real value. They ought to sell them off. I mean, if they already exist, right? Sell them off to somebody.
But the Election Act doesn't let them to do that.
Is that true? Is that in fact true that you couldn't sell a political party?
I don't believe so. You can't. Can you?
You sure?
I don't know of anything in the Act that would prevent it.
I don't think so either. I think that's.
No, but I'm talking about the financing part.
Find some of the dormant ones. Let's buy them. Roll them out as newly branded parties. I mean,
you still have to.
Find financing for.
You still have to go through the hoops of maintaining party registration.
Yeah.
Well, sure. Well, but that's after you get there, and it's actually not that easy.
No, it's not.
To reach the status of registered party. I mean, Bauman's done it on a provincial level, but it's not that easy on a federal level.
No, but without going into the details of that, it is possible.
It is possible.
There's lots of, as I say, there's actually lots of options federally for political choice, but people have to know about it. And if you don't know about it, it's so the raising money is key. If you can't raise money, you're not going very far in politics.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, that people are not aware of that. Then it brings me to the point of the role of media in the electoral process. Because regardless of the amount of the money that a party, large or small, has or could raise, still they have to be able to spend it in a right direction to inform public.
Yep.
And mainstream media is very reluctant to give that kind of the airwave to the smaller party or to independent. And even we witnessed, John and I both, and probably you yourself in your time, that even local debates are trying to exclude anyone but the mainstream political parties. So my question is, doesn't Elections Canada or provincial election bodies, like Elections Ontario or so on, have the right to investigate this kind of the conspiracies? I mean, it doesn't, first of all, is it a conspiracy or not? Because 2 or 3 different parties get together to do certain things that disenfranchise a part of not only the electorate, but also the candidates.
Well, on that point, I mean, in that Toronto Centre by-election, I mean, you yourself made the point that most people thought there were only 4 candidates, period.
And there were 11.
Right.
Now, based on because you were constantly with one party during how many times were you a candidate?
7.
7. So that means you saw the evolution or devolution of the process during certain period of time. But has anything changed when it comes to the media and the role of the media?
No, it's gotten worse.
Okay, and why is that? So,
well, first, how is it? How is it
first of all,
worse?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, there again, because of some of the changes in the rules to what political entities have to declare at the federal level as contributions, because all that stuff is very regulated. And there's 2 kinds of contributions. There's monetary contributions and non-monetary contributions. And the limits for all of those are specified. And so some of the changes that have come into play have kind of put a chill in place for the media enterprises, because corporate donations have become illegal.
After 2003.
Right. So when, for instance, a media organization decides to do a profile on Will Arlo, the Canadian Action Party candidate, and they give me airtime, that airtime has a dollar value attached to it. And technically, the way the Act is written, I need to either pay for, as a candidate, I need to either pay for that airtime, or I need to declare it as a non-monetary contribution. Now, the interpretation that Elections Canada has given that is to ignore that. It is something that I have gone to the mat on again and again at the ACPP. Now, the law says this, that's a non-monetary contribution. Another one is a bank account. You now have to open a bank account as a federal candidate. And when you open a bank account, there are charges that are associated to that. So if you got no money, the charges that come with a bank account, you're going to have to pay, whether you like it or not, because the law says you have to open a bank account. Well, some banks will allow you to open a bank account and they won't charge you fees. Well, that's actually a non-monetary contribution, and it's illegal. So they've made a situation where you cannot, as a candidate, legally accept a free of charge bank account. Because that counts as a non-monetary contribution. Like you could not, if they were to strictly apply the Act, you could not accept a television interview, because that airtime has a monetary value to it. When the TV station or the radio station gives you that time, there's a charge attached to that. That's how they make their business, that they're living.
Because there's a cost attached to it?
Because there's a value attached to it.
But is there value because there's a cost, or is there a value for another reason?
Well, there's a value because airtime gets sold and how much advertising can go with it, right? It's not.
But what if Rogers, for example, said, in the interest of democracy, we're going to give every candidate in any election, regardless of who they are, an hour-long free interview.
And they do that.
And they do that. They send out letters. Everybody gets it. Would it still then have value?
Yeah, it does. Under the strict interpretation of the Act, it does have value, because that's what they do for a living. Rogers is a broadcaster. Broadcasting time has a value associated with it. Well, having said that, to the value, which I agree with you and I am aware of that, but it does not describe or explains why the discrepancy. Because if, let's say, the case of Rogers, which is very relatively benign case, they have, let's say, 1 hour of the program for the local, the candidate from one riding come and sit there. And if there is 10 candidates, they give 45 minutes to 3 candidates from mainstream parties, and then 1 minute each to the others. So if we agree with the issue of the value by the definition of the Elections Act, either provincially or federally, then I am just wondering, let's say, Liberal Party of Canada or Conservative Party of Canada is going to declare that the value of that 45 minutes in their return.
They should.
But do they?
I don't think they do.
Oh,
because
that is the whole point of the...
Right. But as a broadcaster, I mean, if I was a broadcaster reading legislation, I'd be saying to myself, am I going to wind up on the wrong side of the law here? Because if next time this goes around, there's a different interpretation of that particular aspect of the law by Elections Canada, and I give airtime to a candidate who doesn't have money to pay for it, I wind up on the wrong side of the law. Because I'm now at the head of a corporation who has made a non-monetary donation to a political entity, and that's illegal.
But to the known candidate is not illegal because they are in the right side of the law.
Well, no, because then it's safe, as a broadcaster, it's safe to offer your broadcasting time to...
Because if worse comes to worse, you can
they can pay for it.
I see. That's interesting.
You mean the party could pay for it?
The party could pay for it.
The money exists.
The money exists, but I cannot ask Will to come and pay me $1,500 for that 15 minutes or whatever
I don't have it, right? I'm going to say, I don't have the money. So now the corporation is in the position of having made an illegal contribution to a political entity, Will Arlo, as a candidate.
And election body like Elections Canada or Elections Ontario or Election Manitoba, doesn't matter. They don't go after this process to really investigate that.
I won't speak to provincial or municipal electoral authorities. My experience is with the federal one. And
but federal don't go.
And I know that I've had this argument with the chief electoral officer of Canada and with his deputies about what is and what isn't a non-monetary contribution, and the interpretation that's been applied is that airtime from news media, those kind of things, is not going to be considered a non-monetary contribution.
Which brings us back.
And I'm saying, but that's not what the law says. And in any case, what I observed is as soon as that change came, as soon as corporate donations became illegal, and I talked privately to some broadcasters, producers who were making these decisions, trying to get into all candidates' debates on the air, and without any of them expressing clearly and directly that that was their reservation, it was clear to me that it was a reservation, and that not only was it clear that that was the reservation, it was clear that there was a chill. As soon as we got to the place where corporate donations were made illegal, and it was known by broadcasters that something like airtime could be interpreted as a non-monetary contribution, there immediately became a cooling off, a lack of ardor for broadcasters.
Lack of enthusiasm for participation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the effect was to chill off invitations.
Can I segue to something else related to some extent to this, and that is, if that is the case, and let's say now we know that there is no such active enthusiasm for the investigation of the airtime allocated to the candidates, what is the fear of the media of giving Will Arlo or John Richardson or Bahmani Donfar additional 5 minutes? Do they really are so insecure that see that 5 minutes could jeopardize the outcome of the election for the mainstream parties?
No, I think they're just looking at their bottom line. It's a competitive business. They don't want to give away airtime. I think it boils down to that. If we didn't have in the Elections Act actually a stipulation that says that they're required, broadcasters are required by the Act to offer airtime to political entities for advertising at the lowest rate available for that airtime in normal commercial traffic. There's a stipulation in the Act that they have to be willing to supply that. And there's a broadcasting arbitrator who polices it. It's very effective.
On that point,
they wouldn't offer any if they could get away with it.
Well, would that
They're
mean, for example, on this perennial issue of, so-called fringe party candidates and independents being excluded from television debates, for example? I mean, would you interpret this to mean that, say, Bauman could say, I'm willing to pay, I insist on paying, and therefore you have to let me participate in this debate?
I doubt they would acknowledge the issue. They would just say you're not invited.
So it's catch-22 then?
Well,
either way you go, you are being excluded. Either you want to pay.
Well, there is no doubt. There is no doubt that if you're not one of the, it used to be three, and I suppose I would now include the Green Party in the club. There's no doubt that if you're not either one of those four parties or a candidate of one of those four parties, you're going to have to run 1,000 times faster to be heard with 10% of the volume.
well, and going back to the rise of the Reform Party, the Reform Party ran on big donations, right? They had a relatively small number of benefactors with very deep pockets. They ran and they achieved their rising star status under a completely different set of rules that now exist. And you see...
Before 2003.
Yeah. So now you see, having gotten to the levers of power, they want to kick the ladder away.
Sure they do. Sure they do. I mean, they all would. What's interesting about them is that they essentially had to do the takeover of the Progressive Conservative Party to expand their base geographically.
Yeah, yes,
which is what they did. But I'd like to ask you this question. I mean, largely what we're talking about is the problem of existing political parties either getting changes in the law or misusing the fact that they suck up most of the bandwidth anyway to exclude any potential competitors in the democratic process. I mean, that's really what it is. Now, what I'm wondering is this possibly an argument for making the rules of elections a matter of, so they have a constitutional stature, in other words, removing the ability of existing, the party in power to change the rules? See, it's interesting. Let me flesh this out a little bit, because I've thought about this a lot over the years, and and I started thinking about this again in that last Toronto Centre by-election. The problem of exclusion, and the Canadian Charter of Rights, which is of course a constitutional document, gives every Canadian citizen the right to run for Parliament. Okay, yet that right is stymied by the Elections Act, which is a law that would be subordinate, obviously to the Charter of Rights. It's stymied by the practices of individuals
and organizations.
And and then you look, for example, I think one of the most egregious breaches would be in that Toronto Centre by-election, where there's this debate run at a publicly funded school, right? I mean, get this. The taxpayers are funding the school, right?
Yes.
Okay, and they fund the school, but yet they exclude 2/3 of the candidates. I mean, this really strikes me as like there's room, for a smart constitutional lawyer to launch this challenge.
Well,
but I mean, what do you think about the idea of simply constitutionalizing, for lack of a better word, the fundamental principles of elections so that the rules can't be changed by the party in power? Because, clearly that's what's going on.
You see, the problem with that is about 2 or 3 years ago, an organization by the name of Comer, they hired a lawyer, Rocco Galati, who is one of the very well-known constitutional law wizard, to challenge the issue of the borrowing money from the private bank versus the Bank of Canada, which is public bank. And they went to the court, and it is 2.5 years past. Still they are waiting to just get their motion about getting the issue to the court. Yeah. So what you are saying, although it makes a lot of sense, but in practice comes back to how much delay are you going along the way?
Oh, come on now. The difficult we do today, the impossible takes a bit longer. I mean, you have to start somewhere.
I like John's question, though, because the Constitution doesn't say you have a right to vote from time to time.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about, well, sure. I mean, there's the right to vote, but I was specifically talking about the right to run. To run as a candidate. I mean, I think that is unfairly burdened by the ability of the party in power to change the Election Act, and other aspects of it.
Well, I've got a friend who's actually launched a constitutional challenge based on his right to vote being denied him for all but about 3 minutes once every 4 years.
That's
okay. Well, now this is very interesting. In other words, his argument presumably is that to have such a narrow window period to vote
amounts to denial of a right. And he's proposed a different system. It's called an ongoing electoral process. And it's brilliant because the system envisions a system whereby every Canadian always has their ballot. They always have their ballot, and they can change their vote anytime they want. And the job of Elections Canada, for instance, and if this system was adopted, the job of Elections Canada would be to keep track of the tallies. So you vote for the candidate who shows up, and wins the election and becomes your MP. And he goes with a plurality to the House of Commons. But Elections Canada, in this case, then would keep a tally of his support or her support. And if somewhere down the line, electors decided, no, this MP actually isn't keeping their promises, I don't think I want to vote for them anymore. I'm going to move my vote to the other candidate.
It's the right to recall.
Right.
Kind of.
And when...
Well, that already exists. That's called crossing the floor.
No, not at all. Not the same thing at all. It's not the same thing at all. So, yeah. So the voters would decide then. And if the electoral authority got to the place where that MP, the one that's sitting, had lost their plurality, there would be an automatic by-election triggered. And in that by-election period, that MP would have an opportunity, 30 or 60 days, to regain their electoral mandate. And if they didn't get it, the other candidate would automatically assume the seat. We actually ran that system internally at the Canadian Action Party for electing executive officers. It worked very well.
Would you support that as a general principle?
Oh, absolutely.
You would you?
Oh, yes. It comes back to that preferential voting system to some extent.
It's a modified preferential system. But you see, then your right to vote doesn't exist from time to time for about 3 minutes every 4 years. It exists all the time. And you know what? Elected personalities, elected people, actually have to keep their promises. Because if they don't, they're automatically recalled. You don't have to go and start a plebiscite or we don't even have recall legislation federally, but the recall is basically automatic. And in the early going, what we found out within the Canadian Action Party, in the early going, there's some turnover until people get used to the system and until candidates understand that they better stick to policy because anything else is going to get you unelected real fast.
Well, I got a simple question for both of you. How is it possible for an elected MP, how is it even possible for them to keep their promises if they're part of a political party?
That is the problem right now.
That is
because they are just getting vote from you, and then I get the order from someone else.
But you see that they get away with that because the people are denied their right to vote between elections. If people had their ballot in their hand all the time.
So that's interesting. So they go to Ottawa and they just do what the party leader tells them, and then because they do what the party leader tells them, they get recalled.
Yep,
that's interesting.
And let me ask you, what's happened to that case that you said they put it for the constitutional because of that tree?
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing. How long is that?
It's been a couple of years now.
Okay.
Well,
you said about the preferential. I just last night I received an email. Apparently, MPP locally from Scarborough-Guildwood. She was elected just in last by-election in 2013. Just put a motion, private members bill, to make the Toronto's election
a preferential
voting system.
You mean a municipal election?
Yes, municipal for the mayor.
Oh, wow.
The mayor and it was very funny that when I was getting this message from my friend, I replied to her that the first question is why, if they are very, what is good for goose, good for gander? Why don't they apply this, provide this bill for the provincial election? Why they are focusing on the city? And a few minutes later, I found out why. Apparently, she and Mr. John Tory share a certain position in one of those organizations for a number of years. And now Mr. John Tory is a candidate, probably ask for the help. I don't know if it is the case, but it seems like that to me.
Well, I mean, I think that clearly that type of vote, which, you know, whether you call it preferential, what you really mean is, you know, essentially keeping the election going until somebody gets more than 50%.
Yes,
right?
that's
you know, that's what you're talking about.
Well, that's what's being proposed by the private members bill.
Yeah, that is what's for yeah.
Well, I mean, that is, I think, probably a good thing for municipal politics because it's so hard to get rid of these people once they're in. I mean, all you have to do, basically, as far as I can see in municipal politics, once you're elected, is just guarantee that 3 or 4 people run against you in the next election. Because, I mean, what I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but I think there's a psychology to voting, and I think the way it works is this. That, let's take Rob Ford as an example. Well, we could use anybody. So, you know, Rob Ford, as we know, is the mayor of Toronto. I was in London, England last week, and I was reading about him in a tabloid in London, England. Yeah. I mean, the guy's, he's great. I mean, he's put Toronto on the map, all right? But here's the thing, okay? So Rob is running for mayor of Toronto again. And, you know, so we have, Karen Stentz, and we have John Tory and
Olivia Chow.
Oh, is she running? Or not yet? Okay. But you see, the way I think voters are going to think about this is, do I want to vote for Rob or not? All right. In other words, I don't think they think here are 4 here's the best candidate. I think that he's sort of the guy, right? He's the mayor. So the issue is, do you want to keep him or get rid of him? You want to keep him, obviously, you vote for him. You want to get rid of him, then the vote gets watered down. So, I mean, I think that there is a very good chance that Rob Ford will be reelected. And I think that the entry of Olivia Chow into the mayor's race will guarantee it.
Well, I want to mention that something. Preferential voting, I am all for it in all levels of the governments, not only municipal. I prefer to have someone provincially or federally at least have some sort of the way of the votes in hand. Not that 50% is enough, but it's better than 18% we have already as representative of the majority of the government. I mean,
so it's chicken and egg. How do you get there?
How to get there? What about because we are getting close to the end of the program? Within a couple of minutes, I just you brought the name of the Rob Ford. It's very fun. It's very funny because about a month ago I called to his office. And I sent invitation, as I sent to many members, which I didn't get that much of an answer from them. And I haven't received any answer from his office. That whether or not we like to participate in your program or not, or at least acknowledge that we receive your invitation. I didn't receive nothing. And yet, this gentleman, while you were in England, he goes all the way to California, sits in the talk show host by Jimmy Kimmel, and his claim in that show is, customer service is my priority, and whoever calls me, I return his call. I mean, they can say that in the foreign land, but they cannot practice it in their own.
Well, it was interesting. Do you remember, there was a movie a long time ago with Peter Sellers called Being There. And the character was Chauncey Gardiner, who wasn't clear in the movie whether he was brilliant or an idiot. But the one scene in the show that happened from time to time was he would go from one floor of the house to the other floor of the house in an elevator. And at one point he steps out of the elevator in the top and he looks at his companion and he says, "That's a very small room." And it's brilliant because you get that he doesn't really understand it's an elevator. And when you saw Rob Ford on Jimmy Kimmel, because I saw it, and hearing him say the things that he says, you wonder what he thinks an airplane is. Because it seems to me he didn't understand that he was in a different country.
Yes, because he constantly said, "It's your money, it's your money," and he's in the United States.
It was odd. It was odd.
Well, but I mean, okay, but I mean, I think that can mean a number of different things. One thing it could mean is that Rob Ford thinks that the world is his country.
Oh, maybe.
I don't know what he thinks.
It's hard. It's hard to say, but I mean, it's a very, very good example of, why without some kind of you have to get more than 50% of the vote principle of voting. Why it's very difficult to dethrone these people. I mean, if you want to. I mean,
I believe it still is difficult to get.
If you want a multi-party system, that's a bugbear that you have to live with.
Mm-hmm.
And what you hope for is that people make educated choices at the ballot.
Oh, that's madness. They're not going to make educated choices. I mean, there's three things you can count on: death, taxes, and the stupidity of voters.
Well, it's not. My perception is not that voters are stupid. Really, it's they're distracted.
Okay, agreed. They're
distracted and they're not well informed, and they're certainly not being informed by the media. And everybody's life is so busy. Everybody's life is so busy. It's easy to make 1,000 excuses not to be well informed when you get at the polling place, but yet feel like you should go and vote, which is another argument for the ongoing electoral system. Because what you find then is you don't have people who are badly informed going to the polls and making bad choices. What you find is those people probably drift away from the system. If they're unhappy, they may come back and inform themselves and make decent choices. But the people who are informed, the people who do follow the policy, they'll stay with the system and they'll make good choices at the ballot box. And the people who, in normal circumstances, rush to the ballot box to make a choice because they feel like it's their civic duty to make a choice, whether they got any idea what they're doing or not, they do. They show up and they vote. Often very badly, right? Not because they're stupid, because they're distracted, because they're busy, and because they feel compelled, right? If they had their ballot all the time, we noticed this in CAP as well, running the system. When people have their ballot all the time, if they look and they're reasonably happy with how things are going, they don't vote. When they come back to the system to vote is because they want to change and they know what they want.
Well, on that note...
Well, I just want one thought on that. I mean, you say, have their ballot all the time. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I don't know if I go that far, but it does seem to me, I'm more of a let's go after the low-hanging fruit type of person. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that, there is a day where everybody votes. I mean, it should take place over a week or something like that.
Well,
actually, to give people the opportunity to vote at all.
Well, how many people don't vote because they didn't have voting system?
State of Oregon has run a mail-in ballot system for a long time. It works very well. And you can't manipulate it, right? It lacks transparency or the appearance of transparency, right? So there are some downsides to it, but you can't stampede people because they'll mail in their ballot as long as it's received within the time frame. That's fine. Right? And actually, the technical experts working committee looking into the electoral irregularities in Etobicoke Centre, there were two strong recommendations that committee came up with. I was a part of it. And we did some straw polling at the end of the work period when we looked at all that stuff. And there was two strong recommendations that got equal support from I think there was 11 political parties represented there. And equal support came for a complete overhaul of the Elections Act as it's written now. In other words, scrap the Canada Elections Act and start again. And the other one was go to a mail-in ballot system. Now that's from the technical experts from all the political parties that participated. I think there were 11 people in the room. And you can read about that in Harry Neufeld's report.
Yeah.
So that's one more thing that Elections Canada took on, was actually to look into what went wrong, why those voting irregularities showed up, and by the way, there was no evidence of fraud. Strictly technical errors, administration errors. So we have Bill C-23, which is nothing like what was. The only thing that they adopted out of the technical experts working group was they sort of adopted. We recommended they get rid of the 17-day rule, and they moved it back to a 24-day rule. But
Fascinating. Well, it's been great.
Too bad you have a short time. Otherwise, I love to keep listening to that. Thank you, Will, for coming all the way.
For whatever it's worth. Happy to be here.
Oh, no. You travel a long way to come here and educate us. I appreciate that. John, do you want to close the session for our audience?
Well, I guess I would first thank you once again. I mean, it's very, very rare. I mean, I want to thank you not only for coming tonight, but I would like to thank you for running in 7 elections. I mean, I think that honestly,
that is the
I mean, I think
service.
that people do not understand what a great public service it is to run, and how hard it is if you're not, you know, one of the main party candidates. So, you are a true great contributor to Canada. I don't know if you're a Canadian patriot, but you are a true. I don't know that you're not, but you're definitely a true contributor. And you know, coming here tonight and sharing your views is simply icing on the cake. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
So, on that note, good night. And
2 weeks from tonight,
and
we
don't
will be
forget,
back.
participate, vote, volunteer, and even run for an office. Good night.